Welcome to the Gauntlet Podcast. My name is Kate.
My name's Avery.
And I'm Jason.
Thank you so much for joining us, Avery. Listeners, if you're not familiar, this is the famous Avery Alder of Monsterhearts fame and The Quiet Year and a place to fuck each other, because I feel like that needs to be mentioned too.
Yes, it does. Ribbon Drive. I want to throw in for Ribbon Drive.
Absolutely, yes. Ribbon Drive. So Avery of the many talents. Thank you so much for joining us, Avery. It's wonderful to have you here and talk to you again.
Yeah, thank you both for having me, and it's really nice to meet you today, Jason.
Yeah, I'm super excited. It's an honor. I've played all your games so many times, especially Monsterhearts, but even all the little ones like Quiet Year and Ribbon Drive. So yeah, I'm stoked. It's gonna be fun.
Excellent. So we're going to start today with the section we've just started making called Giving You Bleed, as inspired by Jason.
On brand. It's good.
So, Avery, what's giving you bleed lately?
Well, recently I had friends over to play a game of Dream Askew. Made everyone dinner, and we sat down. We kind of chatted and catched up for an hour or so. And then we dove into playing. And Dream Askew is a game that I wrote about queers in a post-apocalyptic kind of like Fallout community, banding together and doing what they can to survive and try and rebuild. And in that game, I was playing the Maestro, who is, this is a game based on Apocalypse World, but it's diceless and GM-less, and more focused on the intra-community conflicts that crop up within a small group. And the Maestro is a character who barters, bargains, wheels, and deals. And this character that I was playing, named Jackbird, felt really slighted by something going on in the community, not being consulted on a new arrival entering the community, even though this person was ex-FBI and potentially a real danger to all these marginalized queer people living out in the wastelands. And so Jackbird got really incensed and leapt into action trying to rally people to say, like, we need more oversight, we need more community input, we can't be letting our bicycle gang run around and make all the decisions for us. We need centralization, and kind of being a rabble-rouser and making a power grab within the community in light of everything that was going on. And at first, I think Dream Askew is like an interesting game because it's set in the post-apocalypse, so it never feels so close to home that you start the game being really critically self-reflexive and being like, how is this character secretly just like a self-insert of who I am? Because you're busy, you know, like scavenging for water sources and stuff like that. But then by the end of the game, pretty regularly, I find that I'm like, I guess I have some personal work to do. And definitely what was coming up for me in playing Jackbird was like, I don't think I necessarily want to make a large power grab and control my community, but certainly I get really easily and quickly hurt when I feel like my work isn't being acknowledged and my importance in a community or in a circle of friends isn't being acknowledged. And that was really revealed to be the driving motivation for my character by the end of the session. And so definitely I left that session thinking like, I probably need to find better ways to like state my needs for validation within groups so that I don't end up trying to take them over in authoritarian swoops of power grabs.
Well, I trust you won't do that.
we're Kate and I are anxiously on pins and needles in fear that you're going to take over the show. So
I would be okay with that.
Actually, I think I would too.
Right?
Yeah.
Jason,
we'll just listen to every talk for 30 minutes.
Jason, what have you been feeling bleed-wise lately?
So I got a chance to play Fiasco on Sunday. I haven't played Fiasco in ages, and we made a conscious decision to play like a serious Fiasco. We did the soft tilts, and we had a discussion beforehand of like, you know, we want to tell like a really grounded, really human, not kind of chaotic story, you know, that Fiasco is kind of known for. And so we chose the playset Planeta Droga, which is about just people whose lives are intersecting with like drug trade, basically. And the story that we ended up telling was about, essentially it was about a woman, middle-aged woman, who was trying to get her son to break his cycle of addiction. Okay, he was addicted to heroin. And it was a quiet story. It was a small story. It was a hard story. We took more breaks than normal because I think we were all a little like really, really shook by a lot of it, to the point where we're even like, we kind of had to like kind of go in at one point. It's like, is everybody cool with this? Like, is this the game we thought we were going to do, you know? And everybody was, but it was just, you know, everybody's really, really kind of, there were some tough moments. The story ended because of the way the aftermath process goes in Fiasco. Like, you don't always have total control over how your character's story is going to end. And so the story ended with the woman. She had actually, in an effort to save her son from a really bad situation, she kind of like got in too deep, and she herself got addicted to, I think it was painkillers. She got addicted to something herself. And so the aftermath, it saw her essentially like herself like kind of descending and going to a bad place. And the very, very final scene of the session was many years in the future, and her being on the streets, and her son and her grandkids walking by her and not even recognizing her. It was hard as fuck. I mean, it was hard. Like, after it was over, it was just like, we were just kind of in stunned silence. And it was really hard for me because in addition to having some people in my lives who've had problems with substance abuse, my early legal career, I just worked with indigent clients, and many of them had, you know, part of the reason why they were indigent was because they also had, you know, they were caught up in the cycle of abuse and substance abuse and various other kinds of abuse, actually. And so it just, I know how drugs can cause people's lives to spiral, right? And I know the very, very real consequences of that at both a personal level and a really like sort of abstract legal way, or sort of practical way, like in terms of like housing and their personal, you know, just finances and everything, right? And so it was just hard as hell. And afterwards on private channels, you know, a couple of us, you know, we're kind of sharing with each other like, yeah, I know people in my life like this, and that's why it really hurt. And so yeah, that was it. And I'm glad I'm not going last because I feel like mine was the downer. So
that sounds pretty intense.
It was pretty intense, but it was good though. I'm glad we did it. You know, we usually just play kind of like adventure-y games and kind of action-oriented games. It was kind of fun to kind of do something like that, in hindsight.
So recently there's been this game that's come out. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It's called Monsterhearts 2.
Wait, what?
It's like this game about sexy teenage monsters, kind of. It's this really great queer game too, and it deals with identity and body horror. Is it all about
fighting against the popular kids? Is that what it's about?
Yeah, that's true. There's that too. Yeah, I read that somewhere.
We're sorry. We're doing an inside joke, listeners. Sorry.
So my friend Rochelle has been running this game for us, and I'm playing an Infernal because it's the playbook I have longed to play in a campaign forever. And my Infernal's demon is, like, his face is Mark Ruffalo. Like, he's an older, distinguished-looking man who's quite lovely and wonderful. And there's definitely this situation between him and my 16-year-old character where he is either preparing her for, or they're going to soon have a sexual relationship. And that's all been agreed ahead of time. Everyone's comfortable with it, but it's really creepy every time he, like, in game, his hand kind of, like, lingers a little bit, or he gazes at her in a way that's not okay. And her friends are like, dude, your, like, friend's really weird. And as a teenager, I actually dated a guy who was in his late 20s. And at the time, it felt very okay and normal. And now playing this character where I'm dating someone who's much older than me in a way, I'm like, oh shit, this is a little fucked up. And it's really made me reflect on my own relationship when I was a teenager and walking away from gay and always being like, oh, I didn't realize how not okay this felt. And really kind of dealing with that in a way and unpacking my 18-year-old self.
Yeah. I don't know how relevant this is, but I dated really like much older than me too when I was in school, like significantly so. But a lot of my friends, you know, a lot of my gay male friends did, and yeah, I don't know if I have like I don't think I have as conflicted feelings about it, but I also haven't played a role playing game where that's come up, so I don't know. Maybe I would. But
my relationship wasn't a good one, so I think that's why it's like, oh no, that wasn't okay. Those things happening weren't okay.
Yeah, for me, it was more like this, you know, there was a certain element of like, I was not out of the closet, and there was a certain level of like almost like mentorship, I guess, for lack of a better word, going on, like kind of showing me like what it means to be, an out gay man or whatever. So I think, so yeah, it kind of had that kind of frame, I guess, but.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to play an Infernal and really focus on the relationship with the Dark Power, mirroring like a kind of unequal relationship you really see in the real world and you see in dating and in relationships. I think a lot of the time when people play it, they're like, my Dark Power is like a Satan kind of guy, and they don't really think about it a lot more than that in terms of like, what does it mean to have someone like this in my social sphere, in my relational sphere?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a cool direction to be taking it.
Thank you. I wanted an Infernal's Dark Power that wasn't immediately, let's kill the Dark Power. Like, I wanted to be someone compelling who was helpful and seemed a reasonable person most of the time, with like this edge of darkness that you're like, oh, I don't know, man. Awesome. So thank you everyone for being open and talking about your bleed. I appreciate it. Today we're going to be talking about violence in RPGs, and this stems from actually a conversation I had with you 3 or 4 years ago whenever you were here for Fan Expo, Avery. And we have been playing the hell out of Monsterhearts, and it always just accumulated in this really violent moment. And I sat down with you, I was like, Avery, I need your help. How do you turn Monsterhearts into a game that just doesn't go into violence? And you had a really subtle and compelling answer, like most of your answers always are about things. And it was talking about the space that we allow in RPGs and even in real life for emotion to go, which turned into this long conversation in my head about like, why are RPGs so violent? Why do they default to violence? And how do we make that violence meaningful? And not just, oh, I killed the orc. Yay, go me. Do you have thoughts you want to start with on that? Because that was your initial conversation with me many years ago. I'm sure you haven't like ruminated on it like I have.
Yeah, I don't think I've ruminated on it solidly for years, but I've definitely thought a lot about how role-playing games seem to push towards violence pretty consistently. And I think even games that aren't focused on slaying orcs and having powerful glowing swords and all that, like even games that are really relational, there's this consistent tendency to push towards increasing emotional stakes and increasing physical stakes and just kind of continuing to go more until the only possible scene that you could have is everyone stabbing each other.
Right, yeah.
And I think that's influenced just by like the culture we live in. I think we live in a culture where most of the stories that we hear and that we are kind of given permission to tell are ones where there's a conflict and we have to fail and try more desperate means, and the conflict gets bigger and we have to continue to like chip away at it, and it just escalates and escalates and escalates until this dramatic climax where everyone's lives are on the line. That seems like the majority of most films and most genres of film kind of like follow that like constant escalation towards a climactic moment.
Certainly the most popular ones, right? Like the most, like the most rewarded ones are.
And I think it's interesting that we, broadly speaking, as a culture, don't have a lot of stories where the most intense, climactic, escalatory scenes happen early on in a movie or in a book, right? It's really rare to see a story which is like there is intense emotional or relational or physical violence, and then we spend the remaining 90% of the story learning how that ripples out, like learning what the effects of that are.
Oh, but what a good story. I want to play that story, right? I mean,
it's weird. It's weird that we don't have really like, I can't think of any stories that really hold to that format, like we think that there's only one place that a climax can go in a story.
Right, yeah.
And it's weird in a culture that produces so much storytelling, like so many movies, so many television shows, so many novels, so many comic books, like that I can't really think of any that put the climax somewhere else. Like we haven't figured out how to experiment about that.
The one thing I've seen do that differently, and it's storytelling, but it's true to life storytelling. It's actually documentary filmmaking, where you take something horrible that's happened, and now we're looking at the fallout of that horrible thing. But I've never really seen stories do that so much. But I have noticed increasingly in documentaries, like Daisy and Audrey is about how two girls were raped and harassed, but we were following them in the aftermath of it.
Yeah, in terms of like fiction, like TV shows, for example, the one that comes to mind, I've been, ever since Avery said that, I've been racking my brain. I've come up with one, which is Twin Peaks, which is a show of, in my opinion, of varying quality within its full run. But it starts with the murder of Laura Palmer. Actually, not even the act of the murder, just like finding her body. It doesn't actually start with the act of her being killed. So maybe it's not a good comparison.
Riverdale does that too.
Which one? Oh, Riverdale. Yeah.
Riverdale.
Yeah. Well, it wears its Twin Peaks on its sleeve, right?
Yes, it does.
But I think it's kind of a similar idea. Like Twin Peaks has violence in it, but those instances of violence are spaced out very widely, like over many episodes before there's another like real strong burst of violence. And so much of the first season, especially, is all about just dealing with the aftermath of Laura Palmer's death, right? I don't know if it's a good comparison because we don't actually get to see. It's not like a climactic thing as much as it's just like. I guess we imagine it, but it's not, we don't see it on screen. So,
yeah, those are both good examples. I think that one of the things that's going on there is that I think we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, like, in storytelling, like, what it means to fully integrate the effects of an event, and how that can be a story. And I think Kate's totally right that is something that we, like, see in documentary filmmaking, but I don't really see it anywhere else in the stories that we tell. And definitely when I wrote Ribbon Drive, one of my goals was to create a story where the point wasn't to build towards a climax. The point was to, like, disentangle things to the point where they kind of, like, ceased to exist, ceased to be meaningful for the characters, and to kind of, like, work away from a climax. And so, like, the story would start with the big, like, we're going on an adventure. We have
right,
goals
yeah.
for our life. We are moving towards them. Road trips are a metaphor. And
Right, yeah.
and then slowly everything that the characters went into the story with would be kind of contested and ruminated on and kind of turned over in their brains, and they'd slowly let go of it.
Yeah.
And so that was definitely an attempt to design a game that was both, like, anti-violence, but also specifically, like, anti-climax.
I'm super glad you brought up Ribbon Drive, actually, because I played a game of Ribbon Drive about maybe 3 years ago where the beginning of the journey of the road trip, the setup was the family had just had a fire, right? Everything in their home burned down. And the sort of golden child son of the family died in the fire. And so the road trip was the remaining children and the parents going across the country to start a new life, essentially, and kind of picking up the pieces from that incident and kind of, like, learning to love each other in some ways, right? Because there was a lot of, like, unresolved, like, tension, between the family members vis-a-vis the son that died. So, yeah, I'd never thought about Ribbon Drive in that way, like this idea of it's an anticlimax, right? But it actually makes so much sense. I mean, I imagine most games of Ribbon Drive don't start with that really hot premise like ours did, but I can see it, right? Like, it makes sense to me because the major thing, the climax, was the fire, right? Which was off screen. We didn't see that,
Yeah, in terms of media, there is one movie I can think of, actually. I sat here and I ruminated on it. It's Imaginary Heroes. It starts with the son killing himself, and it then follows the fallout of the family and how they cope with it or don't. And there's no climax really after. There's a little bit of a reveal, but there's no real climax after that. There's just living, kind of.
Well, so, like, what is it about role-playing games specifically that maybe leads us to always want to default to violence? I think that's kind of an interesting question. I think there are probably some really obvious answers there, but I'd be curious about hearing about those, plus maybe something that's less obvious. I don't know. What do you think?
Okay, so to get the obvious answers out of the way,
sure.
Role-playing games as the specific art form, I think, evolved out of miniature war games.
Right,
so
yeah.
Historical context, that's there. Most role-playing games to date still have a semi-adversarial relationship between one person who has power to command vast armies of nameless bad guys, and then everyone else playing a hero. And a hero is someone who triumphs and is powerful and does violence. And so adversarial GM relationship and historical context of coming from minis war games seem like the obvious answers, but I think there's probably more interesting ones too.
Yeah, my obvious answer also was, I don't know if it's an obvious answer, but if you don't know anything about role-playing games, or you don't know anything about a specific game, and you pick a book up off the shelf and fully 3/4 of it is dedicated to like the combat rules, or the magic and combat rules, or the wrestling, the grappling rules, you're going to think the point of this game is to combat, right? I mean, so I think there's a certain signaling that goes on with books too, but particularly more traditional role-playing games, right? Obviously, like in story games and more indie stuff, you don't see that so much, but that's what I always think. I'm like, whenever I see people talking about, oh man, we had the most the most fantastic game of Dungeons and Dragons that was just about getting to know each other and hanging out at the inn or whatever. And I think, okay, well, that's cool, but they're not really selling it. They're not selling that to you, right? like you found this cool outcome, that was a little different, but yeah, I don't think that's like the implied thing that's supposed to happen in that game.
I think also because the hero, as Avery pointed out, is traditionally one who does violence. They're also traditionally dudes, which isn't to downplay that men are bad or say anything like that. It's to say more that because men aren't allowed to have an emotional space, their emotional space often is violent. Their emotional response is supposed to be violence. When a friend is hurt by someone, they go beat up the person who hurt the friend. If their lives are in danger, they're going to go to war. Like, their emotional space is often led towards violence. And because RPGs, for the longest time, were male-dominated, I think that's an easy fantasy fulfillment, in a way. That gives them agency. Like, you're not allowed to walk around, ideally, in real life also, and punch people who piss you off. And RPGs let you do that. They let you walk around and be the bad guy if you want, or stop someone from hurting a loved one in a very direct way.
Well, so what do we think about that? Like, is there space for the power fantasy, do you think? I mean, is it something that, I think I know what Kate's going to say, but you should say it,
That's
Kate.
a loaded question. And I'm pro power fantasy. Ha!
I think that power fantasies are a part of telling stories. And I think that it's important for people to have outlets for being allowed to tell stories about being unreasonably powerful. That's great. That's fine. I think it is telling and unfortunate that the power fantasies that get told in role-playing games are predominantly those of people who in the real world are already very powerful, kind of superimposed into a fantasy setting and then given even more power and then exercising that power upon the powerless. When we say power fantasy, we typically imagine capable, able-bodied men doing violence to people who are weaker than them.
Conan.
And it's unfortunate that that's what power fantasy means in storytelling, that it doesn't mean like marginalized, oppressed people suddenly having the power that they need to get by in the world without making compromises. It doesn't mean that. It means already powerful people being more powerful.
Right, yeah, hence the nature of my loaded question.
I think the power fantasies are fine, but why are all power fantasies in stories about people who are already powerful becoming more powerful? Why are they not about redistributing power? Why are they not about leveling out the playing field?
That's interesting. Yeah.
And as I say that, I'm thinking of a Twine-based computer game called All I Want Is For All of My Friends to Be Incredibly Powerful, which was designed by Porpentine. And it's a game about living through 3 days in the life of someone who just feels like, presumably she doesn't have a lot of power and agency in her own life. Every day, a capsule slides down the tube and she opens it up and she's given her GPS coordinates for her day's job. And she goes there and she does what she presumes she's supposed to do there. And there's a lot of kind of like a sense of forcing yourself to do the things that you think that you're supposed to do. And midway through the game, there's a tilt, and suddenly there's power and agency and choice and irreverence and reversal. And this is about someone finding herself and finding liberation and finding other people out there doing things to like help liberate her and becoming part of a secret movement that she didn't know that she needed. And that's a really cool kind of power fantasy. So
that's
I wish there was more of those.
Awesome. Yeah.
It sounds like the reason violence is the default or violence is the most common part is because we haven't made space for violence to be seen otherwise, or other conflict resolutions to be the dominant ones. Like, it's clearly the default because culture and its history, but it's also, do we have a lot of space in RPGs to not default to violence? Like you said, it's always building towards that climax, and that climax is often violent. And how do we not do that?
Well, a minute ago I was talking about kind of the push towards like escalating constantly towards a climactic moment about 90% of the way through the story, and then a tidy wrap up at the end as being kind of like a default model in our culture. I don't know, I always find that I go into like any like kind of podcast or interview like and suddenly realize like, oh, this is just the one thing that I'm apparently talking about incessantly on repeat the whole time. Okay, that's what's happening this day. But I guess escalation is it right now. I think that we tell stories that revolve around escalation. And I think one way to shift away from violence, or at least violence as an unexamined default, it would be to tell stories that center around integration. Like, how do we take what happened in the last scene and integrate it into the way that these characters see themselves, and the way that these communities operate, and the ways that this conflict is evolving and changing, and the sides and the conflict, and whether it is even still a conflict. If we told stories that were about integrating the repercussions of every scene throughout the next scene, then I don't know, in a lot of cases we would still be telling stories about violence, we'd still be telling stories about like stabby knife fights, but we'd be seeing how the repercussions of those actions like changed people, which I think, even if just a story about physical violence, is a more interesting story about physical violence.
I think that's the most interesting part of anything like that happens either in the background or on screen that's violent or traumatic. I always think the more interesting story, the more interesting thing that happens is how like the people involved or the community surrounding the incident or whatever, like how they react, how they respond. To me, that's where the story is, you know, kind of going back to my rip and drive example, like I like the idea of just that traumatic event kind of hanging in the air, you know, as opposed to being something we had to do on screen or something we had to even like RP out or whatever, you know, like just have it be this thing that hangs over everything and kind of casts a pall, right, on the situation. So I don't have any new thought there. I was just kind of, that makes a lot of sense to me, what you just said. Like, I think that is the most interesting part of, to me, like, I think it's kind of where this conversation is going, is like, how do we make violence more interesting, or how do we incorporate violence into a way that creates good narrative, right?
I think my one concern with that model is if you were playing like Urban Shadows or any game that does, or any Powered by the Apocalypse system that still relies on the fail mechanic, or 7 to 9 versus 10, where you're going to have your big violent moment and then you're going to start rolling afterwards, and eventually one of those is going to be a 6, and there's going to be a hard move, and it's going to escalate.
Right.
And it's going to escalate. And that's kind of the premise of Powered by the Apocalypse, right? Is that it escalates.
The snowballing, yeah.
But yeah, that's the whole idea. How do we mitigate that or use that escalation in a way that doesn't automatically lead back to the same pathway we just were like, no, we're not going here. Oh crap, we're here.
I mean, I'll throw out there that I think this kind of goes back to our last roundtable discussion a little bit, but I think nothing beats like a conversation before every session that kind of talks openly about what kinds of things we have in motion, what kinds of conflicts are on the table, and whether it happens or not, where do you guys see this going, right? Like, it's a technique I use when I'm GMing. We set aside like a full 10 minutes or so before the session begins to just talk about like, okay, we have this going on over here, we have this going on over here, and your character has expressed an interest in X, Y, or Z. What kind of scenes do you think are going to come out of this? What would you like to see happen? If it goes to this, tone-wise, how should we handle that? Like, it doesn't mean we're going to do that. More like brainstorming, I guess, like writer's room brainstorming in a way. Often it doesn't go the way we think it will, but I think like putting it all out there and like setting expectations before you begin, I think can help with that a lot, because you might have that person at the table who, just because it's the easy answer, they immediately go to violence, right? Like, and it may not be because they're like an inherently violent person, or because they, it might just be because they didn't have like any expectations set beforehand, or they didn't benefit from sort of a group discussion that kind of like establishes some sort of shared goals and standards, right? Does that make sense? Like, I think just having that like sort of that open discussion at the beginning goes so far to like allowing you to stick the landing on this sort of type of story that you want, right?
I think that thinking about the Powered by the Apocalypse games in particular, each of those games talks about MC moves or hard moves or reactions or whatever they're called in a slightly different way, using slightly different vocabulary. But one of the things that I recall from Apocalypse World is that Vincent and McGay say like that one of those moves is supposed to make the characters' lives more interesting and throw a twist in. And they say it's not necessarily supposed to make the character's life worse. Sometimes, of course, it's going to make their life worse, but not necessarily. Like, that shouldn't be the default. And I think that often it just is the default. When people think about, like, okay, I have to make things, like, more complicated, and this is a failure, and so it's, like, supposed to be, like, more complicated and worse, or more difficult, or more interesting with all the negative connotations attached. They immediately go towards, like, well, whoever the adversary is should just escalate, should just do something more intense or more mean, or there should just be like more risk of bloodshed attached to whatever the antagonist is doing. And I don't think that's the only way that things can snowball. I think that there's lots of different ways. Like, more concerned parties can be brought into the picture. More people can have conflicting needs. Loved ones can require more of you while you still have these ongoing struggles that you're trying to focus your attention on. And so you can have stories that are about like, well, you've still got this kind of like villainous adversary that you're trying to square off against, but now your mother has fallen very ill, or now more people are coming out saying like, that person's my dad. Like, I'm really afraid for him. I know he's kind of gone to a weird dark place lately, but like, if you kill him, I don't have a family anymore. Please don't. And like, there are different directions that you can take snowballing, and I think that we go towards, well, the adversary should just escalate again too often.
Well, and that's where the fact that, they always say, PBTA games are a conversation, right? It's a conversation. I think that's where that conversation becomes super important, right? Because I know sometimes when I'm emceeing a game, I find myself like, okay, I get a 7 to 9 result, right? And those are the trickiest results sometimes, depending on the move. And I'll catch myself like falling into a rut, like I just keep doing like the same kind of thing, in which case I just kind of disclaim responsibility for making the decision, like I'll turn it over to the table. I'm like, what can we do here? I don't want to just have the guy attack. Like, what else can we do here? Do you guys have any thoughts on that? And then people will kind of jump in with their different ideas. And, I think I don't know if that's in the rules of the game, but it's in the spirit of the game for sure. And I think that there's a line between like sort of like player skill and just like making up for like player skill with just like open conversation and arriving at like good outcomes, And so, yeah, I often do that. If I find myself like defaulting to something or just getting into a sort of creative rut, not even just about violence, but just about anything, I'll turn it over to the players. And I think it's a good move to kind of like just keep it fresh and kind of explore different types of things.
I think that's in the principles of at least a lot of the Powered by the Apocalypse games, right? Is sometimes disclaimed decision making, and I think it's there for a reason.
I know it's in Monsterhearts. I remember reading it in Monsterhearts, right? Or at least disclaimed scene framing. I know Monsterhearts. That's the one where I was like, that was the first game I played where I was like, I could just let the players frame the scenes if at this moment, it's cool. So.
But I think that advice specifically, like mid-scene to disclaim decision making, is there in part to like relieve some of the workload of the MC, to say like, hey, if any decision feels burdenous, you actually don't need to be the one to make it. You can just collaborate on that. But it's also there because if there's always one person who's making the decision about what the consequences of a failure are going to be, like it's just going to go in a single direction. Like whatever that person thinks failure means in a story, you're just going to see that over and over and over again.
Yeah, for sure.
And so having that ability to let other people inject their own ideas of like, what even is failure? What does failure mean to a story? I think it's really important to, make sure it doesn't fall into a rut. I think that's not a personal fault of yours. I think that's just like what everyone does when they tell stories.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a thing. It's easy to do. Well, and falling into a rut, and in our specific discussion, like defaulting to violence, it's just really easy, right? I mean, it's just, like I run a lot of Dungeon World, right? That's the main thing I run, and it's just so easy to, on a failure to have like a thing attack or like some kind of violent thing occur. It's just like the easiest thing.
Yeah, even in Monsterhearts, because I've been playing that a lot lately, and I'm emceeing it as well. Every time I went to run it or play it recently, everyone's like, okay, guys, I want to have a conversation about how I don't want this to be a violent game and how I want violence to mean something. So I think the narrative is switching, which is part of the reason I wanted to talk about it. And one thing I think I've done in my game is I'm playing the Infernal, who starts with a 2 volatile. Like, they're kind of a bruiser. And I decided it meant she was just really good at running away. Mm-hmm. She was not a volatile character in the sense that she hurt people. She was just always really good at getting out of places instead of staying and letting the violence happen. So I think you can make deliberate choices, even with a character that is set up to be violent, to use that in a different way.
Yeah, that's a good point.
One of the things that I have written in Monsterhearts 2 in the full text of the game is there's a section on violence, and it specifically talks about how Monsterhearts doesn't have a combat system at all, and that's something that the need to clarify that came out in Apocalypse World forums, where people would say, like, would talk about Lash Out Physically as if it was a combat system, and a few times even use the phrase combat system, and
which just seems so weird. It sounds like the weirdest thing ever. That phrase.
Well, I mean, I can see why it goes there. It's like, it's the move where you do harm, and then people record harm on their sheet, and it's like, what kind of weapon are you using? You'll do more harm. Like, maybe it's unfair for me to say that there is no combat system in Monsterhearts, but I think it's like important to like highlight how like the 2 options for your volatile stat are fight or flight.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not because fighting is a strategic choice that you're making to engage in battle with someone. It's because like you're a teenager with poor impulse control, and you're making like stupid rash decisions because you're panicking. And like punching someone and running away are 2 sides of that same coin of like, what do you do when you panic? And characters with high volatile stats, they panic in big explosive ways. Right, they run away or they punch someone. Characters with low volatile stats, they often don't. Like, they often panic in other ways, by shutting down, by like kind of dissociating from their present circumstances to gaze into the abyss, to confer with the ghosts who live in their head, or whatever the case might be, right? And so I've talked in the text of this second edition about the fact that lashing out physically isn't supposed to be a combat system. And if there's a situation where like my character punches your character in the locker room, and then your character punches my character back, that's fine. That sometimes that happens. Sometimes characters break out into fistfights, but I think it's important to like, when you hit that like, and then I hit you back, it's important to like kind of like pause for a second and check in with yourself about like, would my character actually then hit you back? And is that actually the most interesting story? And what is my character feeling, and what is your character feeling? And is my character sometimes turns into a giant wolf creature and eats people by accident and then feels guilty afterwards? Am I afraid of that happening right now? Am I afraid of giving into violence? My boyfriend's standing across the hall. He's watching this. He looks scared. Am I going to like alienate and scare him and make him afraid of me by like retaliating again and escalating? And so there's kind of that focus on like, on making sure you don't fall into the trap of being like, right, you punched me, so I have to punch you back. That's how this works. Because that's not actually, I think, how it works in the real world most of the time. And in like the genre. In both cases, like, you get hit, it's scary, it provokes emotions, it changes relationships. And like,
absolutely.
This isn't a game where you get to kill unnamed bad guys and get experience points and then like tidily go on your way. Like, you have to go back to class the next day with these people. You know, like, you still have gym with them tomorrow. Like, you're going to be back in this locker room again, changing into your like gross, smelly gym strip. And so yeah, there's advice in the new text about like thinking about like, when a character hits another character, how does that feel for everyone involved? Who's afraid? What actually happens next? And trying not to fall into the default assumption that the next thing is obviously going to be that you just keep hitting each other until someone's dead. Which, like, sometimes if that's the most interesting place to take the story, like blow by blow, that's just like where the story is most interesting. That's wonderful.
I'm sitting here with a tight little smile on my face because I'm totally amused by the idea of Monsterhearts 2 having a grappling rules section. So
No.
No, I love that. The Monsterhearts 2 combat rules. That's pretty. It's just super amusing for some reason. Anyway.
Well, so my partner played in a game of Monsterhearts with a bunch of my friends. And it escalated to this point where the two characters, like one who is a PC and one who is like an NPC, who is like the quarterback of the football team or whatever, they were meeting up at the flagpole at 3 p.m. There was a large crowd. Everyone was there. This PC was like, well, on this like tablet or smartphone I've got here, I found your like gay sex tape, and starts playing it. And things like continue to escalate from there to the point where they're like
I hate when that
attacking
happens,
one another.
I mean, come on. It's the worst. I hate when that happens. Just...
When people track you down at the flagpole and play your gay sex tape.
Yeah. I know, it's the worst.
Yeah, there were lacrosse sticks involved. It was apparently a whole thing. But this scene kept escalating to the place of like these queer kids had originally planned to like, yeah, we're going to show up at the flagpole at 3. We're going to have a showdown with the jocks. We're going to like teach them a lesson. We're going to like kind of like queer strike back. This is going to be awesome. And what ended up happening is it kept on going awry, and they found this sex tape, and they like, because they're impulsive teenagers, couldn't not use it. But then it led to this situation where they outed this quarterback as like a fellow queer kid, and then proceeded to fight him and accidentally kill him by hitting him with the tablet. And so he kind of got beaten to death with his gay sex tape. And afterwards, these queer characters were like, we did that. There's some symbolism going on here. We have to live with this for the rest of our lives. And I think in that situation, like, it was like weird and gonzo and chaotic, but was just the most interesting place for that scene to go. But I think it's rare that that's the case. I think it's rare that the situation is like most interesting for you to continue escalating until someone's dead.
Yeah. My heart's still a little bit broken here. I don't know how to recover from that.
It was apparently a very weird game that went in a lot of weird directions, but that was one of them.
It's a good story. I'd read that. One thing I wanted to bring up was looking at rule sets. I played a Pillion recently, and there's actually no violent move in that game. The best you can do is angry moon magic, essentially, to make violence happen to other people. Right, it's kind of like My Little Pony, right? But I was playing the warrior, who's a character that, when I picked it up, was like, I'm going to hurt things. I'm like, oh, I'm just going to yell at adults, apparently. Right. That's what the warrior does. They yell at adults. And I thought it was a really interesting take on the warrior and not having a violent move in the game. Like, even though we were facing creatures that we should essentially be fighting, we were trying to come up with creative solutions to how to stop the creatures because there was no way to fight the creatures. So it kind of took the option away of just defaulting to a big fight scene, and we were trying to like trick them and use moon magic and have a happy ending. It didn't work out, but it was a goal.
Nice.
Great. That was a lot of really good points on how to not make violence the be all end all, and if it is violence, to make it good for a story. We're gonna cut to our next segment, which is Giving Me Life.
This episode of the Gauntlet Podcast is being sponsored by our friends at Nocturnal Media. So right now, listeners, Nocturnal is in the middle of a Kickstarter campaign for a game called Cold Shadows. Cold Shadows is a tabletop role-playing game built on the rule set Blood and Honor by John Wick, as well as World of Dew by Werner Wonderworks. Cold Shadows is a narrative tabletop role-playing game where the rules are focused on telling a dynamic, personal, and compelling story. The game is set in a taut world of espionage, betrayal, and drama, inspired by the great spy stories of authors such as Jean Le Carré and Robert Ludlum. Cold Shadows is written to evoke the feeling of the Cold War era of spies, both in modern and a historical context. The game can easily be used to tell espionage stories in any 20th and 21st century time frame. I've taken a look at the Kickstarter. It looks great. I've backed it. I'm pretty excited where this game is going because I can't think of too many 20th century Jean Le Carré style spy games that have a narrative focus. So this is pretty cool. If that sounds interesting to you, go take a look at that Kickstarter. We will have a link in the notes. And thanks again to Nocturnal for supporting us.
So this is Giving Me Life. Avery, what's been giving you life lately?
Okay, so for the last 4 months or so, I've been increasingly curious and excited about food preservation in a wide variety of ways. I've been reading up about canning and preparing to do more canning, but the biggest project that I've been diving into is fermentation. And for the last 3 weeks or so, I've been making sourdough. And
awesome.
It's been a really exciting process for me because I think living in this city and being chronically ill, and for the last several months I've been recovering from surgery, and it's been kind of like a really slow, uneven process for me. And in all these ways, I feel like it's really easy to become disconnected from food and to feel less nourished by it on like an emotional level, or I'm like hesitant to say spiritual level, but I think that's really what I mean. And so for me, having this like cultivation practice where I'm like working on feeding this starter, and like it's cold here. My kitchen doesn't have a heat source in it, and we have single pane windows, so my kitchen's always cold, which means I've had to like move my starter to my bedroom. And so I have this like small little like bubbling pot in the corner of my room that I like tend to several times a day, that I feed regularly, that I'm like understanding the rhythms for. And it's like having this like, I don't know, like the yeast will like kind of like rise up and swell within the starter, and I'll have to make sure to stir it at least a couple times a day. Otherwise it'll like spill over from this little pot and like just ruin my carpet and ruin my stuff. And so it's like suddenly attending to my food in a different way, like attending to it in like having this like relationship to it that evolves over days, and remembering to care for it multiple times a day. And then
you're describing a Tamagotchi, but yeah.
And then like the payoff of it being that it feeds me regularly. So it's like exciting. It's like having like a small pet made out of wheat in the corner of my bedroom.
I was going to say, it reminds me of when I had chickens.
Yeah, we moved out of a place that had chickens at our last house, and I wasn't super involved in the care for them, but I think it's similar, and it's making me feel like, yeah, connected to food again, as well as like
that's awesome.
Excited about like the like slight like mad scientist quality of like having like a weird bubbling cauldron in the corner of my room at all times.
Yeast cultures.
Yeah, I'm excited to like continue on this path in like weirder and weirder fermentation projects, and more of them, until eventually it's just like the house is just breathing with weird cultures and bacterias. That's the goal.
Then write a game about it.
To live inside like a weird spore colony. But that's been giving me life. It's been helping me to feel connected to like daily rhythms and connected to my food, and like I'm taking care of another living being and having like a kind of like weird precious relationship to it. I mean, I have kids, so I also have that already with humans, but
your bread child.
My bread child.
Jason, what's giving you life?
So the last time I feel like my last two giving me lives have been like politics stuff, and whatever. I am so excited. I am so excited to see the Trump administration start to run up against the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, and how you don't get to just do whatever the fuck you want. You actually have to, you actually have to deal with huge, massive bureaucracy that has its way with things, It's totally life affirming. It's it's heartening. And just today, Michael Flynn got fired from his job as a national security advisor, which is pretty great because if anybody's paying attention, it was Michael Flynn's son who started that ridiculous Pizzagate thing. I don't know if you guys know about that, but basically, it was a story about how Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring out of the back of a pizza restaurant in D.C., and it took off. It was a whole thing in the news for like a day, and the Flynns were partially responsible for that. So I'm just really glad that asshole lost his job. It's giving me life.
Yay! So there's been this beautiful amount of memes on the internet right now about Justin Trudeau meeting President Trump that have absolutely delighted me, between the find someone who looks at you the way Ivanka Trump looks at Justin Trudeau, to one of the admin getting his name wrong and calling him Joe Trudeau. That has absolutely delighted me all day. And I don't like Justin Trudeau, whatever, but it's so fascinating to see this relationship between Trump and Trudeau, where it's so, they're so different. It's just so obvious. And it's delighted me today.
We find the bright spots where we can these days, right?
Right, and it's in the way he looks at the handshake. And it's so good.
Awesome.
All right, Avery, I want to thank you so much for taking time to join us on this podcast and talking to us about this fascinating topic.
Yeah, it was a really nice conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Listeners, if you want to check us out, you can find us online at gauntlet-rpg.com, or if you're feeling generous and you like what we do, throw some money on Patreon. Thank you for listening. I hope everyone has a fabulous week.
Okay, then. So the first part is the bleed section. We should call that "Giving Me Bleed." Kate, doesn't that make sense?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it does, but yeah.
It's on brand. It's totally on brand.
It's giving you bleed. Oh, yeah. I guess that's the way that. No, that's happening. I'm typing it. It's happened. I've edited the document.
It's official now.
Yeah, it's real.
And then just say that's our show. Have a great day, or something like that.
I have to wish them having a good day.
Or, I don't know. You should just some other little thing. A little thing. This is all going to end up in a stinger.
Have whatever day you are going to have. Goodbye.
How do we not do that?
Well, I guess it just depends on. I mean, this is assuming that the goal is not to have a violent moment that is, that. Or I guess what I'm saying, I don't know what I'm saying. Steve, cut that. Sorry. I had no thought. I had no thought. I just realized I have no thought to that. Let me start over. Avery, you can take this one.